I got this email today from my assistant. His brother is married to a Ukrainian wife, and her parents live in, I'm not going to mention the city. They now have Russian flags planted in their city. Roads and bridges in some airports have been blown up. There's no access to fuel. The grocery stores have no food. And then they were saying that their Russian neighbors here in America are saying, hey, this is not our heart. We don't want this. Most of the citizens of Russia don't want this, but they can't speak up. So I am anything but an expert on European geopolitics. So I've asked to join me today on short notice Dr. Fred Markert, who is the international director for Youth with a Mission. He was converted out of atheist communism in Berlin in 73, began his missions ministry by smuggling Bibles into the communist countries of Eastern Europe. He served in missions for the past 48 years, has ministered in over 150 countries. There's much more I could say about him, but I want to bring Fred right on. Hey, thanks so much for joining us on short notice today.
It's great to be with you, Michael.
So, Fred, first the big picture. Why has Russia invaded Ukraine from your perspective?
Well, there's actually a lot to talk about here. There's actually two competing priorities that are at the core of this conflict. Number one, we in America don't understand how Russia thinks. Russia has no natural barriers on their borders. From Russia all the way to the west into Europe, it's one big plain. And Russia has been invaded 6 times in the past few hundred years as armies come right across the plains and decimate Russia. So Russia feels like it needs buffer countries because there are no mountains or rivers or any natural barriers. In America, we don't have that same insecurity. We have the 2 largest moats in the world. We have the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean on either side that protect us. Plus, we have Canada and Mexico, 2 friendly countries to the north and south. So we have never felt that same insecurity that Russia feels. So it absolutely feels it needs boundaries. And that's really their perspective, is they want boundaries to prevent being invaded. Of course, the Western countries, our concern is the spread of democracy. And we want to preserve and help promulgate democracy in countries that want to become more free and democratic. And so these 2 competing values are what we're facing here: Russia's need for security and our desire to see democracy spread.
So let me just jump in.
Go ahead.
The fact that countries that were once part of the Soviet Union or served as a buffer against other potential forces, now most all those countries have become NATO aligned and therefore would be considered as potentially hostile to Russia in a time of conflict. Ukraine would be the one country that hasn't. So is that part of the issue here that adds to this desire to have a buffer?
Absolutely. At the end of the Cold War, we actually NATO committed that it would not expand into the Eastern Bloc countries. And then it violated that commitment by embracing countries in the Eastern Bloc, which made Russia incredibly nervous because NATO essentially they saw as their enemy. Though we saw it as defensive, they saw it as offensive. And so we broke that commitment. But we also broke some other commitments, Michael. In Budapest Memorandum in 1994, we told Ukraine, if you give up your nuclear weapons, U.S., England, and Russia will protect you. And so we've broken that security assurance, and that's a big problem. We've broken a number of assurances we've given over the years. Then in April of 2008, at the NATO Bucharest summit, NATO declared we will bring both the Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. That was a shot across the bow of Russia. And so that was another thing that got Russia up in arms, is made my enemies coming right to my doorstep in the Ukraine and in Georgia. It would be like China or Iran or Russia putting an army in Mexico on our border, or Canada on our border, or it's very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that also caused Russia to be insecure. Then in August 2008, April 2008, NATO said, we'll bring these two countries in. In August, Russia said, no way, and invaded Georgia to prevent it. Then in 2014, as Ukraine was making noises to move closer to NATO, Putin was again feeling insecure and invaded the Crimea and took that. And then the most recent thing that provoked this is that Ukraine declared in September of 2020 that they intend to join NATO, and we're actively pursuing that. And so I agree with those desires for democracy. At the same time, Russia saw that as an offensive threat.
All right. So is there truth to the idea that Putin, who has been serving as the leader of Russia for many, many years now, it's hardly just a free democracy as we'd be used to here in the West. Is there any truth to the idea that he has goals to reconstitute a Soviet Union, and that this is a lot about his own megalomaniacal desires?
That's absolutely true. At the collapse of communism, well, shortly after the collapse of communism, he made a statement, Michael. He said, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the last 100 years was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, because they feel they need all the buffer countries, all the stands of Central Asia to protect them from Iran and other countries, India, Pakistan, etc., and the buffer countries in Eastern Europe to protect them from the West. So it is his goal to reestablish that empire once again, which is problematic because those former republics of the Soviet Union want to remain independent. One of the difficult things is that Stalin mixed up all the nationalities on purpose, Michael. He took Russians and put them in Azerbaijan, and took Turkmen and put them in Ukraine. The reason is it would produce racial tension, which then forced the people to look to a strong central government to keep the peace. So there are Russians in all of these former republics, and that's the pretext that Putin is using to go into these countries. He's saying, I must protect the Russian nationals in these countries. So we have a really challenging situation, but it has greater implications, actually, for the global order and the growth of the global church. This is really a dramatic thing that's happening.
All right. So before we get the Christian perspective in terms of how we should look at this and the implications regarding the gospel, and that's ultimately your great focus, Fred. We've got a couple minutes before the break. What's the worst case scenario, simply on a political global level, of what could happen right now?
Well, Michael, we can talk about this in the next segment, is what the sloppy withdrawal from Afghanistan and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates is that America is no longer the world's sole superpower. Since 1992, America has been the world's sole superpower, and that has ensured that there's no great power war, or what we call world war. But this demonstrates that now there are three great powers that have arisen, and that's us in America, Russia, and China. And this is one of the most critical events of this century. In fact, Michael, no century has been without a world war, and the 21st century will not be any different. And this is a harbinger of that world war, World War III, which is to come. And so this is not a minor thing. This is a major hinge of history, a pivotal moment. And how the West responds right now is going to determine the next 100 years or so.
Mm. And is there, in your view, a right or wrong response from the West?
We are between a rock and a hard place. You know, there are no solutions. In America, we often think there's got to be a win-win scenario in any given situation, but there isn't. We are in a lose-lose scenario with this. If the West engages militarily, it could easily escalate into World War III. If we don't engage, it also emboldens both Russia and China, as well as Iran and North Korea and others, to rise up and take similar action. China wants Taiwan.
I tell you what, let me just jump in here. We'll talk on the other side of the break about the potential falling of the dominoes here. And then from a Christian viewpoint, a global Christian viewpoint, what are the implications, how we should be praying. We'll be right back with Fred Markert. Shifting our normal Israel-Jewish focus over to the conflict in Ukraine right now. It is massive. My guest, Fred Markert, who is the International Director of Youth with a Mission, has explained that this could well be the harbinger of World War III and that there is no easy solution. If America gets involved militarily, it could trigger this next global war. If we don't get involved militarily, then it just sends a signal, hey, go in, take over these countries. We're not going to stop you. 866-34-TRUTH. So, Fred, I don't want to be pessimistic or alarmist, and I want to step back in a moment and just get a larger global Christian perspective. But what might be the falling of the dominoes if America and Europe get involved militarily to tell Russia, you can't just do this? Then how might the dominoes fall with Russia and some of these other players that you mentioned, North Korea, Iran, China?
Well, in international relations, that really deals with how countries go to war and how they use their power. We are now in a season called testing. It's like when a little kid, is testing his mom and dad to see what he can get away with, right? And so that's what's been happening the past few years. That's what's going into Crimea was, and many other situations like that. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are testing to see what they can get away with. What we're showing under the current administration is that they can get away with a lot. We won't stop them. So that means it clears the way for China to take Taiwan and to be more domineering even in Hong Kong. And it gives the signal to other regional powers like Iran, who are deadly enemies with Saudi Arabia, that they can continue their proxy war in Yemen and actually try to. So there are many far-reaching implications of this, Michael, and it's the core root of it though is America is in the process of civilizational collapse, which we can stop and turn around, but it's due to our immorality. In Daniel 2:21, God says, "I change the times and seasons. I remove kings and I set up kings." Right? So God is the one who raises up nations and tears them down, right? Raises them up to global power and tears them down. And why does he do that? Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And we are far from righteousness, and that's why since our morality has decreased, our global power is decreasing, and we're in the process of God tearing us down. But the great hope is Jeremiah 18:7-8, where God says, if at any time a nation or kingdom on whom I pronounce judgment repents of its evil ways, and I will relent of the evil I had planned for it.
Yep.
So I do believe there's hope. This is happening because America's become immoral. God says you no longer have the right to be the global superpower because you are damaging the world through pornography, immorality, through the movies you export, the music you export, and so I must let you decline. But if we return to morality, I believe we can see this turned around.
Yeah, and friends, I encourage you to visit gapmovement.com, as in Great Awakening Project movement.com, gapmovement.com. There are strategies there, Great Commission strategies, strategies for awakening in America that could then enhance the fulfilling of the Great Commission. So, Fred, you sounded the alarm. You've made us to understand how critical and dire this situation is, one of the most critical moments we faced in the world in many years. From your perspective, you've ministered in over 150 countries. You are in touch with Christians on a globally as much as anyone I know in terms of knowing other leaders. What, and maybe you get the short answer to this, but was there a general consensus of how Trump was viewed as our president the last 4 years and how Biden is viewed? Or is that too general a question?
Well, very generally, I can tell you people did not like President Trump. They didn't like him as a person, but they liked his policies because his policies protected the world. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea had no idea what he's going to do next and thought he's capable of anything. So that kept them suppressed from doing things like invading Ukraine or taking Taiwan. So they didn't like him as a person. They did appreciate his policies. On the currently, they see the current administration as weak, and they understand that that's why we're seeing the rise of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And so that would be a very general statement around the world right now.
And something that makes a lot of sense, even as to why many of us voted for Trump, not liking his person and not finding his character what we wanted it to be, and knowing there were negative implications, but seeing the policies as important nationally and globally. In any case, in your bio mentions your focus is on the 3.2 billion unreached Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, and the 1,700 plus languages, many of them small dialects, which still have no Bible. So just looking at this as believers, in America, we know almost nothing about Ukraine, generally speaking, but Russia bad, Putin bad, invasion bad. So it's just the good guy versus the innocent Ukraine. It's kind of looked at maybe naively in that way. And I don't know, in no way minimizing what Putin is doing and the horror of this invasion. But as far as the gospel is concerned, obviously we don't want people slaughtered. We don't want people killed. We want them to live and have the opportunity to know about the Lord. But what are some of the possible implications of this for the gospel, both good and bad?
Okay, so Michael, very brief international relations lesson. The world goes through three stages that have repeated now 27 times in 5,000 years of recorded history. There's what we call a multipolar world, where there's three or more great powers, which fight it out for control of the world. Then it moves to bipolar. Some of those powers lose their power in the wars, and two powers fight for control of the world. Then it moves to unipolar when there's one superpower. To just go back 2 cycles, it was the colonial period when the European powers multipolar. Then it went bipolar, England and France. Then it went unipolar with the British Empire for 100 years. When their power collapsed in 1914, we went multipolar again, and you had the great powers, Germany, Russia, Japan, America, England, fighting World War I and II. Then we went bipolar at the end of World War II, America, USSR, and then unipolar again at the collapse of communism at the end of 1991. And what history shows, Michael, is that when we have a unipolar world, when there's one superpower, the kingdom globally rapidly advances. But as soon as that global power loses its power and we cross over into a multipolar world, then the kingdom globally declines dramatically. And I've proven this. I'm writing a book that documents all this. I've proven this through history. And so the greatest implication of this is that as we've now entered a multipolar world, and when you cross that boundary from unipolar to multipolar, we get great power wars soon after, or what we call world wars. So that's how we can tell it's coming. But the implication is that we will not get the gospel to the remaining 3.2 billion unreached Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists, nor get the Bible into the 1,700 remaining languages. What analysts say, if America doesn't turn around, then we could have 100 to 300 years of a multipolar world full of war, and it will be after that we'll have the ability to complete the Great Commission. So it really is morality in America is the whole issue here. Because we're immoral, we've lost our power. God is letting us lose our power. If we return to him, Jeremiah 18, he will restore that power. And once again, we can, hopefully without war, suppress the bad boy countries or the countries that resist the gospel. That's a better way to say it. We can suppress them, which will allow the gospel to go forward with great speed.
Yeah, Fred, that's a brilliant analysis, 100 times better than I could give on that subject, and done it with an incredibly concise way. It reminds me of being at one of our missions conferences with our organization Fire, and I was overwhelmed during one of the songs singing about the nations, and I fell to my knees weeping and said, God, I'll go anywhere, send me anywhere, I'm your servant. And then the thought hit me, well, why am I so focused on a gospel-based moral and cultural revolution in America? And immediately I heard the words, as America goes, the world goes. So this is about the nations. Fred, keep up the great work. Friends, visit GAP Movement, G-A-P, gapmovement.com. Thanks for this analysis. I'll write it up, Fred, and get this out as widely as I can. And from here, we focus on what we must, Jesus himself. Hey, friends, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, click on one of the boxes on the screen, check out another one of our videos, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a single video. You know, we discovered that about 60% of you that are watching our videos aren't subscribers. So subscribe today. Doesn't cost you a dime. And if you want to support our work, Line of Fire, and all the things that we do, follow one of the links on the screen below.